Salvete omnes, and welcome back to Caesar, Book 5, Chapters 30 and 31, following the AP syllabus. Before we begin, as ever, a quick reminder of our color coding. Words indicated in red are going to be our subjects. Anything in green is a verb, even if it may not look like one right away. And words indicated in blue are direct objects. Also, anything indicated in bold type is the main clause of the sentence, while anything not in bold is somehow subordinate to it. So, with that out of the way, let's get right into it. The Romans, in chapters 28 and 29, have been debating, really, the messages that they have received from Ambiorix, that all of Gaul is in arms, the Germans have crossed the Rhine, and the only course of action for Sabinus and Cotta is to take their legion and 5 cohorts and depart immediately from the territory of the Eburones, seeking out the aid of either Cicero or Labienus. Cotta, many of the tribunes and centurions are firmly against this plan, saying that they should stay and fight it out because they will likely win and help will come to them, while Sabinus, on the other hand, has been shouting that no, the danger is too great, and they need to move with all possible haste. And so that is where we find ourselves right now as we start in chapter 30 with this ablative absolutes. Okay, chapter 30, by the way, is just a single sentence long, so we will be doing a great deal of scrolling here at first. And I mean, there isn't a Latin teacher in the world who hasn't joked with their students about that. It's not that I'm assigning you a whole chapter to do, it's just one sentence. But with that out of the way, here's this ablative absolute. Hac in utramque partem disputatione habita. With this dispute or debate having been held in utramque partem. We've seen utramque before. Uterque, it means both of two, which is why, even though grammatically it is singular, we can understand it and we'll probably end up translating it as plural. With this debate having been held on both sides. So each side has put forth their argument. Cum, we see cum and then we see resisteretur, a subjunctive. So because is going to work here. Because he, the note reminds you that Sabinus is the subject here of resisteretur. We see him right there, all right, as our actual subject of this whole first sentence. Since Sabinus was being firmly, acriter, the adverb, firmly resisted or keenly resisted, vehemently resisted, by Cotta and the primis ordinibus. Now we remember that primis ordinibus here is referring back to, in chapter 28, the centuriones primorum ordinum, the centurions of the first rank. So Cotta and the centurions are the ones firmly resisting Sabinus. Then he says, and this is something we don't see terribly often in Caesar, direct quotation. All right. And Sabinus says, inquit is really only used in Latin when you are indicating direct quotation is coming up. What does he say? Vincite, right? An imperative. Win. Go off and be victorious. Si ita voltis. If you desire it thus. All right? If that's what you want, we might say in English. So Sabinus appears to be, in a way, conceding the debate to the other side. Go off and win if that's what you want. But then he goes on and adds more to what he was saying. Et id, and this thing, which is coming up, the id is pointing ahead to what's coming down here and further on, right, as we work our way through the chapter. This thing, clariore voce, ablative of manner, in a clearer or even louder voice, ut, purpose, so that magna pars militum exaudiret, so that the greater part of the troops could hear. Okay, so Sabinus has raised his voice now so that the troops, presumably outside the tent where the officers have gathered to debate the situation, would be able to hear what he is saying. So what he says next, then, we need to understand, is meant for the soldiers to hear, not necessarily just meant for the officers to debate. So, what does he say, right? Just toss off this inquit. Neque is sum. I am not the sort of person. This is, right here, is going to lead us to qui, which we see from the subjunctive terrear, is actually a relative clause of characteristic. Okay? So, I am not the kind of person. That's the way a relative clause of characteristic works. I am not the kind of person who... And then terear is first person because he's speaking of himself, but when we translate it into English, it might sound third person-y, all right? I am not the kind of person who is terrified. We don't need to strain ourselves trying to make terear translate in the first person, who I am terrified. We don't need to worry about that because of the overall context of neque I sum qui. I'm not the kind of person who is gravissime, who is superlative, extremely or very, very seriously terrified. Ex vobis, from y'all, right? I'm not the sort of person from y'all. By the periculo mortis, by the danger of death. Sabinus says, I'm not the kind of person who, among y'all, is terribly scared of the threat of death, claiming that he's a bold man. And then he goes on to say, he sapient. Now the he here, these men, they, right? Who are the they? Could be the officers and centurions in the cabin, in the tent where they're having their debate. Could be the soldiers outside the tent to whom Sabinus is pitching this statement. Because remember, he is saying this in a clariore voce, in a louder voice, specifically so that the soldiers can hear. Okay? They will know, sapienta, future tense verb. They will know if gravius quid. Now, even though the quid is over here, because we see it with si, we remember our rhyme. After si, nisi, num, and ne, Ali takes a holiday. So this quid is actually aliquid. Gravius is the comparative adjective describing it. If something or anything, because that's what aliquid means, right? If something or anything more serious happens, all right, if something more serious were to happen, they, right, still the he, they will reposcent, they will demand a rationem. So we would say something like they would demand an explanation, right? Ratio, a reason. They would demand an explanation from you, okay? And it's not clear. I mean, the te would suggest that he is assigning his remarks. He's addressing directly Cotta, his co-legate. But, you know, he might be referring collectively to the officers gathered in the room. But, you know, the te is probably Cotta, right? He's addressing Cotta directly, even though he's meaning for the men outside to hear this. They will demand an explanation from you. Going on down. Qui. Now, this qui is not te. It's not Cotta. It's they. It's the he. All right? The men will demand a reason from you, an explanation from you, if something really bad happens. The men who si per te liceat, this is the impersonal verb licet, if it is allowed by you or through you. So basically, if you let them, granted them the ability, if you let them. On the following day, right, parendino die, with the nearby camps, this is just a prepositional phrase, it's not a cum clause, just a prepositional phrase, conjuncti. So there's a lot of parallel construction here in the way Sabinus is phrasing this, all right, or the way Caesar is rendering what Sabinus is supposed to have said. So we're going to see a good number of participles here before we actually get to the verb. So talking about the men who, having joined up with the nearby camps, this is referring to marching either to Cicero or Labienus and connecting with them, which will happen parendino die, right, on the day after tomorrow. Remember, neither Cicero nor Labienus is more than about 50 miles away from the Romans, and we think of Caesar. Good rule of thumb is that one of Caesar's legions would typically march 20 to 25 miles in a day. And given that, in this case, the Romans are probably highly motivated, they could probably manage 25 or more miles a day. So a camp, Cicero Labienus, 50 miles away, no more than 2 days away. Hence, parendino die. Okay, moving right along. Continuing on. Now remember, we had to go on to the next page here, but hold in your mind that idea of conjuncti cum proximis hibernis. Having joined up, right, the men, having joined up with the nearby camps, what would they be able to do? Here we actually see the verb. Okay, and it looks a little broken up because, again, he's being very, Caesar's being very artful in this, so we see that they would be able to sustain or endure, right, the shared misfortune of war. And then in the middle of that, we get this prepositional phrase, cum reliquis, with the others, with the other troops, with the other men. Sabinus is saying, if we don't do what I am proposing, then, and if something bad happens, then the men will demand an explanation from you. The very same men who, if you let them, in a couple of days, they will have joined up with the nearby camp and will endure this shared misfortune of war together with the rest of the troops. And they will not, let's finish this sentence and this chapter, they will not, having been vis reiecti and relegati, don't go with non. Non goes with intereant. All right, so we might want to imagine a little comma here. They will not, our men, having been cast aside and abandoned, far from the others, either by the sword or by hunger, die. So Sabinus is framing this as basically a binary choice, right? Either you let our men go and join up with the nearby camps where they will be able to endure this shared misfortune of war together with their friends and allies and countrymen, or they will die abandoned and deserted, far from the rest of our men, either in fighting or through hunger. Okay, so that is how Sabinus has pitched this choice. And again, let us always remember in this chapter, he is doing it so that the troops outside the tent can hear him. Okay, moving on now. Chapter 30 is over. The direct speech is over. Sabinus has made his point, and now we're going to get a relatively simple and straightforward chapter because things are about to come to a head and then get resolved. Consurgitur ex concilio, chapter 31 begins, literally with this impersonal verb. There was a rising up from the council. This is just the Latin way of saying that the council, the meeting of the officers, has ended. Comprehendunt utrumque. So, this utrumque, here's both again. This is referring to the commanders, Sabinus and Cotta. And then comprehendunt, this plural, is almost certainly the rest of the officers, okay, the tribunes and the centurions. They grabbed them both. All right, so the legates, having reached a position of intractable difference, Cotta wants to stay and fight, Sabinus wants to leave and join up with the nearby camps. Neither side is budging, so the rest of the officers grab them, all right, both of them, and beg them. And then, so now begging, we're going to be going into indirect speech. But we start off, let's scroll down here a little bit, with this nay clause, all right? Because we are begging, let's go back up so we can see the orons here. Because they are begging, we understand this nay clause to be a negative indirect command, which is technically a purpose clause, hence the negative takes nay. So they're begging them not, we would say not to lead, right? Ne deducant, not to bring this situation into the greatest danger. A more literal translation might be, begged them that they not bring this affair to the greatest danger. That might be a more literal translation. The subject of deducant, by the way, is Sabinus and Cotta, not the officers anymore. All right, the officers begged them that they, Sabinus and Cotta, not bring this affair into a place of great danger by means of their disagreement and stubbornness. Pertinacia, right? Teneo, holding on. Let's go on down here to the indirect speech. They said that, because they were begging, they said that faculum esse rem. The situation is easy. The choice, you might say, the rem. The choice is easy. Seu maneant, seu proficis cantur. Remember that seu is an abbreviation of sive, if or, right? So either if this or that. So either they stay, that's also why we have subjunctives, okay? Also, we're in indirect speech, so we know that in indirect speech, subordinate clauses tend to take subjunctive verbs, so hey. Either they stay or they leave. If only, all right, this if is bouncing off of this faculum SRM. The situation is easy. They either stay or they go. But it's only easy, see modo, right? It's only easy if everyone, let's hold off on the object here, if everyone thinks and approves of one, we could say plan, unum concilium maybe. So, right, the officers are pleading with Sabinus and Cotta that they must agree upon a plan. Because contra, on the other hand, this is an adverb contra, not a preposition. On the other hand, in dissensione, in disagreement or in dispute, they, the officers, see no safety, nullam salutem. There's no safety or health or security in disagreement. So the legates need to come to one voice or disaster will befall the troops. Okay, you know that things are happening quickly when Caesar's sentences get simple. The situation in its dispute or in a debate all the way until midnight was let out. So it continued. The passive verb, the situation was drawn out, we might say, in argument until midnight. Okay, well, whatever happened, things seem to have switched because finally, Cotta per motus, notice again, Caesar has kind of chiastically arranged these four words with the subject in the middle there. A very upset Cotta. Remember we saw per movebantur a couple chapters back? The Romans were per movebantur by the words of Ambiorix. And we talked about how moveo, with this case, when used this way, doesn't necessarily mean physically, but instead emotionally, intellectually, all right? So a very upset Cotta having been upset, dat manus. Literally, he gives his hands, okay? This is an idiom that means to surrender. Like we might today, we raise our hands up. He raised his hands, so he surrendered. Notice just an interesting note, the use of the present tense, even though this obviously has already occurred, adds immediacy to a narration. If we translate it, we can render it in past time. Cotta surrendered. The opinion of Sabinus won. The only thing we need to remember when doing the AP is that if we're going to do that, we must be consistent. All right. If we're reading a historical narrative with verbs in the present tense, we can render them in the perfect tense or in the past time. We just need to be consistent. We cannot go back and forth. When in doubt, just render them in the tense given. But again, we are reading historical narrative that has been put into the present tense for dramatic effect. So you can translate it in past time. An upset Cotta gave his hands. He surrendered. The opinion of Sabinus won, prevailed. So now we know what the Romans are about to do. It was announced, imperfect construction with the passive voice, right? It was announced at first light, or that at first light, right? Everything following here is an indirect speech, but it's just so simple that we might as well just deal with it, right? It was announced that they would depart at first light. Boom, right? Very, very simple. Don't even need to worry about it. There is, of course, an essay missing here from Ituros, but we should be used to essays missing. Okay, so now they know what they're doing. And so consumitur vigiliis reliqua pars noctis, the remaining part of the night, we start here at the end, was spent, or literally consumed, in watch shifts. All right, so vigilia are night watch shifts, literally, right? It's where we get the word vigilant, which means to stay awake. So the remaining part of the night was consumed essentially in wakefulness. So not only are the Romans keeping the watch like you would, right, at night, but they're also, one presumes, staying awake because they're going to undertake a large expedition in the morning, and it's fraught with danger, and so one can imagine that sleep might have been hard to come by. And then, of course, we see kind of what was going on, right? Not only was the night watch sort of hopefully doing its job, but also when, right? Because we see the verbs are in the subjunctive here. Circum spiceret is in the subjunctive, so cum, when, or possibly even because, right? Because quisque miles, each soldier, quisque, each soldier was looking over circumspiceret sua, neuter plural, his things, possessions, we would understand. And then these are two indirect questions, quid secum portare posset and quid ex instrumentu bernorum relinquere cogeretur. These are the questions that the soldiers are asking themselves. What could he bring with him, meaning each soldier, and what from the gear of the winter camps would he be compelled to leave behind? Cogeretur is passive, with, again, quisque miles as the subject. So it almost seems, as one might expect, the troops are awake because they're packing, and they're trying to decide what they need to bring with them and what needs to be abandoned, right? Cogeretur relinquere, what they are forced to abandon. Continuing on, not only are the men awake with night watch duty, not only are they awake because they're looking over their possessions and deciding what they can take and what they have to abandon, but also omni ex cogitantur, everything was thought out or considered. So the men are talking as well. They're discussing, all right? They're thinking about quare. Now this quare is basically cur, okay, why? All right, it is technically two words, qua and re. You will sometimes see it spelled as two individual words, but you'll also frequently see it spelled as a single word. Regardless, it simply means why, and it's introducing, again, another two indirect questions because of these subjunctives right here. Why, not without danger, could they remain? Now, the verbs are singular in form, but they're also being used impersonally. So when we translate, because we understand the soldiers are the ones thinking about this, we can render them into the plural because there's basically a dative of agent missing, right? Elise, why it was not, why for them, right? There could not be a remaining without danger is kind of how that would work, right? So you can read the neck sine periculo, you can read the neck with sine periculo as a kind of litotes, or you can just read the neck with maneatur. It was not, there was not a remaining without danger. Okay, it's kind of just depends on how you want to do it. The sense of it is exactly the same. So they couldn't stay here without there being some danger. But at the same time, right, also, because of the tiredness of the troops and because of the wakefulness, again, this notion of they've been up all night, the danger was increased. Okay, so you see the Romans are thinking through all of this. It's like, well, they're having sort of their own debates. Well, we can't stay here without danger, but we're all tired and we've stayed up all night, so that's going to increase the danger as we march out. And finally, here we are, last sentence of chapter 31. Prima luce, at first light, thus from the camps they set out. And then we have this lovely phrase right here, ut tedatum, which has within it a quibus, and then esset persuasum. So there's a lot going on here. The ut quibus is basically, the quibus is dative. The dative is because of esset persuasum, so it's a dative of reference. It was persuaded to them. So again, the problem here that English speakers have is that this is a very, very highly passive construction and a very impersonal construction that Caesar has put together. But in English, we don't always do well with those passive impersonal constructions. So literally, let's do it literally first, and then we'll go back and do it more colloquially. As people for whom it had been persuaded that not by an enemy, but by a most friendly man, Ambiorix, their plan had been given. That is a painfully literal translation of how to deal with this ut tedatum. They set out from their camps just as, sic ut, okay, just as men for whom or to whom it had been persuaded, a pluperfect here, esset persuasum, that, which kind of takes us into a sort of indirect speech sounding phrase, not by the enemy, but by a most friendly man, namely Ambiorix, their plan had been given. These obs are going with datum esse. So that is how that works literally. Colloquially, though, we might say, they set out at first light from the camps just as if they were persuaded that this plan had been given to them, not by an enemy, but by Ambiorix, an incredibly friendly fellow. So that's what's going on there. You don't need to worry too much about how you render it into English, unless, of course, this shows up on the literal translation portion of the AP. Ha ha ha. But that is what is going on. So the quibus is dative with esse persuasum. This entire expression right here, the plan was given to them not by an enemy but by a very, very friendly man, is technically the subject of persuasum esse, right, of persuasum esset. And of course, just as we've seen before, it's rendered in a sort of oratio obliqua style with the accusative as the subject of an infinitive. So let's not belabor that much more. Instead, let's finish up this chapter with these two wonderful ablative absolutes. These are ablative absolutes, by the way. The participle, which would presumably be a participle form of esse, is missing. With their with their marching line, this is not a battle line, with their marching line being extremely long, and with their baggage being extremely great. Notice both superlatives. A very, very long marching line and very, very much baggage. This will become important very soon. Okay, and that is it for chapters 30 and 31. The debate has been resolved. The Romans have decided upon a course of action, or perhaps more accurately, Cotta has given up and allowed Sabinus to decide on a course of action. And so now we're going to see how this plays out for them. It's a bold plan. We'll see if they can pull it off. So, maximus gratias for sticking through it to the end, and we will see you in the next one. Valete!